Hi, Wargamers. It's Umpire LaFondios. This is an experiment. Let's spend a few minutes with frontages. I've been researching frontages as a result of trying to wargame out the Moltke problems. And it's a really tricky thing. And it's very much like when you study history, they'll give you locations and bits of information, but the whole picture is a little confusing. So I, of course, went completely hog wild and bought this book. It's um, it's a 124-year-old book. It's basically, if you translate it, it's tactical training problems. I'm not going to try to speak German because my high school and university German has already gotten me derision on the Moltke problems. So I want to make sure that I don't offend any more of my German friends. But these are tactical training problems. And this is from the 112th Regiment, which is a Baden regiment. And of interest, this regiment actually served in the First World War at Passchendaele. So officers who looked at this actual book likely experienced something like that, which is pretty interesting to think about. So in this, the most valuable thing is they describe company, battalion, regiment, and brigade overviews of how they should be managed. And they're just really kind of 5 paragraphs each, but they give a really interesting perspective. And that got me started, of course. I went online and found more about frontages. The original document that I saw about frontages was the Lardy's rule set from Kriegspiel 1862. And they talked about how the blocks were used. And so this is how I conceive of a battalion block. This block is square. It's 200 meters by 200 meters. And I adapted this from the blocks that are in the Lardy's Kriegspiel books because they use half battalion blocks, which are in paces. This is how I conceive of it as I wargame out the Moltke problems. So let's do a little perspective, for example, right? So I have here in my hand a measuring tape, and this is about a meter, right? So it actually goes beyond I can't get it into the shot there, but a meter is about that wide. And so in German tactical manuals, the frontage of a single person is 0.8 of a meter or 80 centimeters. So it's less than that. So you can picture kind of with all your kit on, that's what a person is considered to be their frontage. So let's look at that in a larger perspective. And this is an American football field. And that football field, 100 meters or 100 of those measuring tapes goes from the back of one end zone all the way to the goal line of the opposite end zone. So it chops off one of the end zones essentially. But that's 100 meters. And I got the idea for this video as I was out walking the dog, and we went by a local football field that was used for one of the local schools, and it just got me thinking about sizes or distances and frontages. So this is 100 meters as you look at an American football field on television, or if you're standing on one. And for those of you in Europe who want a little bit of context, an actual soccer pitch is 105 to 109 meters. So it's a bit longer. So the 100 meters on a soccer pitch is shorter. So I'm going to use a football area just for everyone, whether you're in Europe or the US, as a reference point. And a yard obviously does not equal a meter, but it just gives you a sense for the distance. So when we look at our Prussian manuals, the one of which I have here, it talks about a company of 250 men having a front bright or a frontage of 100 meters and a depth of 100 meters. And when I lay that out, you have to take 2 football fields or football areas and kind of fit them in to give you a sense for the size. So that's that square. And if you look at the number of soldiers in a company, 100 meters by 100 meters does not make any sense, because if a Prussian company was broken into 3 platoons, which they called Zugs, but we'll just call it platoon for simple English. So there were 3 platoons of around 80 to 83 men each. And the reason for the odd numbers that you had junior officers and NCOs. And they would be in 3 ranks. I've seen from the Lardies to German tactical manuals that you would actually have your platoon be in 3 ranks. So if you took and just did the math of 250 men in a company and broke it down to 3 ranks and 3 platoons, it would look kind of like this. And in fact, you'd have around 30 men across. If you use your 0.8 meters per man, you would then have a frontage of around anywhere from 25 to 30 meters, which, so if you looked at your football fields, it would look a little bit like that. So when you say a company is 100 meters by 100 meters, really it's 100 meters deep, when in what you see here is company columns. So this is a Prussian company in company columns of 3 Zugs of around 80 to 83 men each. Okay, that's at peacetime strength, of course, right? So what's going on here in this picture? So if you look at the left, you see there are the 3 ranks, and you see the platoon leader there. That's a Zug on the left-hand side, or a platoon. You see the platoon leader there waving his saber as they charge forward, and on the horse is probably the company commander sitting in the middle. And then you look to the right and you say, well, what's with those guys, right? So they're obviously in skirmish order. They're not in ranks. And in fact, they're in a completely different formation, but they're close enough that they're likely in the same unit. What's going on there? That makes no sense. Well, the artist has obviously shrunk the perspective here to get all of the action into one photo, because that's not the size of a football pitch or a football field. So this is likely what we're seeing there. This is a company column actually broken with skirmishers out. So what the Prussians would do is they would take one of their platoons and they would put it in skirmish formation and push it forward. And then they would have their 2 other platoons back. And that's what you see in that picture, is the platoons back were trying to stay out of fire, and the platoon forward was actually in skirmish formation, trying to mitigate the negative effects of fire by spreading out into skirmish formation. So this is also a company in a 100 meter by 100 meter formation. Very different than a company in column, which is about 30 meters wide and 100 meters long. So if we keep looking at other implementations of how a battalion would be arrayed, you then see that the Prussian companies to the front would have their skirmishers forward, and some of their platoons in column. And then the companies in the rear, and this is a 2 up front and 2 in the rear formation, would actually be totally in column. And the reason that they would be in column is until the very last moment is that column was controllable by the officers. So you wouldn't necessarily be shoulder to shoulder, but you'd be close enough that you could hear the officer speak. If we cut back to this book, what it says in this book is there are 2 types of formations. There are support troops, and there are what they call forward troops. And that's how they describe it in this book. The forward troops are the ones in skirmish formation. The support troops are the ones that are behind supporting the skirmish formation. Because in both this book and in the book Tactics, which was written around 1903, the main source of firepower is your skirmishing formation. So the pictures of long lines of Napoleonic infantry that we sometimes have in our heads weren't how they considered the greatest concentration of firepower. The greatest concentration of firepower was troops in an open formation, using the terrain, and as such being able to pour as much fire out as possible. And so you already see now in this period, very different than both Napoleonic, also American Civil War, and then it looks more like some of the more loose formations you'd see in World War I. So this is a battalion in one of its formations. So if we go back to remembering that original image that I showed you of a battalion and its 200 by 200, in the book of the 112th that was in the 112th Regiment's library, it says that a battalion can be 200 to 300 meters ordinarily, or extraordinarily, they can be 300 to 400 meters, or 400 meters would be extraordinary. So here's another formation at the 300 meter point. you see there an entire company in skirmish formation forward, and then the 3 additional companies in the column formation in the back. Very different than the earlier formation. So that's 300 meters wide. And in the tactical book, it says the skirmishers should go out 400 meters to make sure that the companies are not receiving enemy fire. So they're protecting those companies in column. So they were very aware that if they moved more quickly in column, they were actually more vulnerable to directed fires. The 400 meters extraordinary look would be something like this, where you could have a battalion on line and you could have your skirmishers out front and then 2 of your platoons in column behind. And so that would be what it would look like for 400 meters. But if you think about how we see units on a table, and they'll look at that old Napoleonic rectangle, and we think of them as lined up that way, this was considered an extraordinary formation. So it was more ordinary to be in the 2 up, 2 back, or 1 up, 3 back than it was to be in line, though it certainly did that. And in fact, in the Lardy's book, it talks about one of the attacks specifically that looked like this, where an entire battalion was put in skirmish formation to cover a brigade, in which case they were actually probably out 400 meters covering the entire brigade, and the entire brigade was in column behind that. So the point of it is that if you look at the different formations that a battalion would be in, we will often think on the wargaming table about a square or a rectangle, and it all moves around as a square, a square or a rectangle. But in point of fact, the movement was very dynamic of these units, and they would switch all the time. So you'd push a platoon out and put it in a skirmish formation. You push another platoon out in skirmish formation. And skirmish formations, though they were difficult to control, still a lieutenant could actually direct it generally in 45-degree increments. So it would give it, a lieutenant would say march to the right, and then they would just generally aim to the right, or march to the left, obviously, and generally aim to the left. So though they were not controllable, they were still somewhat controllable, and the columns would then come up behind. So there was this dance that was going on, and you see this in the way that the regulation talks about it in the 112th Regiment book about where the officers should go. It says early on, the officers should go to the front, and then as the battle progresses, the officers should move to the rear so they can feed in these units into the skirmish order. So let's now take them back to the wargaming table and look a little bit and give a little perspective, because as we look at wargaming pieces and look at wargaming maps, we kind of get an idea in our head. But now that we have a little bit of a background and have used the football pitch or field analogy, let's look at what it would look like. So this is just a legend from a map that I made based on one of the Moltke problems. And that legend has a 200-meter legend. So in fact, the white bit there shows you half of that is going to be 100-meter, which that 100-meter is the size of a football pitch. And now you go to the next one, and that just, the little green spot there is actually one of those football pitches put against that legend, just to give you a sense for size. And now if we open up to a map that we would play a game on, and this is actually quite a small map for games, you see there that that's the size of a football pitch relative to that map. And so that gives you a sense for those words are quite large on the map. So we just talked about, I'm going to move my unit to Praunheim, for example, or Praunheim, pardon my pronunciation, right? But in fact, you're talking about moving it, 7 or 8 football pitches away. So we oftentimes lose perspective on these map exercises. So if we look at that and we look at the general sizes of units, what you see here is I've laid out, and this is by the dimensions that we just talked about. You see on the bottom there, 4 companies grouped together in 100-meter by 100-meter increments. Again, not completely filled with people, but giving room for that company to change all those formations. You see there 4 companies grouped together beneath 2 battalions. So those 2 battalions would be at in fact, around 300 meters of distance. And then above that, we have 2 regiments, which are 3 battalions each. So this gives you a sense for when you look at those units on a wargaming table, look down to that small green box. That's the size of a football pitch. And so if you take that football pitch and just imagine it, that's the size of these units as they move across the field. And beneath that is the dynamism of the different formations that are occurring. So when you give your order, I'm going to move my unit forward and attack, what's actually happening on the, in real life, what would actually be happening is this incredibly dynamic change of columns to skirmish, skirmish thickening that skirmish line, the skirmish line moving as the lieutenants are trying to find a way through, as men are running and trying to find places for cover. There's artillery, of course, there's cavalry, there's all sorts of things happening. But when we look at a wargaming table and we see these blocks move around, it doesn't nearly convey the unbelievable sense of dynamism that's happening, and that within frontages that we just throw out in our wargaming table and our war games, there's a lot going on within that frontage, and there's a lot of change and dynamism. So as you play your war games, as you simulate these things, just remember that piece just really represents an area of activity, and inside that area, there's a lot going on. There's a few minutes with frontages. I thought this was kind of an experimental approach. I hope you enjoyed looking at frontages of Prussian units relative to football pitches. Thanks so much.